Good morning and welcome to today's webinar on OSHA Update, presented by our sponsor, Heffernan. We're super happy that you can join us today. My name is Michelle Wilcox and I will be your moderator, and I will also be monitoring questions you have during the session. Before we open up the session, let's review a couple of key items. All of the webinar materials we discussed will be found at the URL currently showing on your screen. I will be sharing this URL in a follow-up email, so don't feel like you need to write it down right now. If you have trouble with your internet connection during the webinar, we recommend leaving the presentation and logging back in. We do not control the audio on your device does. So if you have audio difficulties, try adjusting the volume settings on your device. The telephone line goes down during the call, hang up and call back again at the same number. If all lines go dead, watch the on-screen chat box for an alternative call-in number. Feel free to ask questions or provide feedback by using the chat box or questions box during the webinar. If you are using a tablet, you may need to tap on the screen for the options bar to appear, and then you can select the appropriate option. We may not respond immediately, but we will work your questions or feedback into the presentation. If we can't get to your comment or question during the session, we will be online afterwards to respond, or we may follow up in an email if we run completely out of time. You may also email us at moderator@aspenrmg.com for up to 48 hours after the webinar. This will be a 1-hour presentation. Questions and comments are very much encouraged throughout, and the presenter will be answering questions at the end. Lastly, we have a number of upcoming webinars covering a variety of topics, including those listed at the Heffernan webinar website. In addition, we are also offering mandatory preventing sexual harassment training in English on June 11th. Our presenter today is Erica Baird. Erica is a safety, health, and risk management consultant with 20 years of experience in the insurance and safety industries. She's had the opportunity to work with a wide variety of industries such as construction, retail, manufacturing, education, agriculture, and service industries. She has presented on numerous safety topics over the years, from hazard communication to proper lifting technique, and led seminars on safety leadership. Erica has a bachelor's degree in psychology and Spanish, an associate's degree in occupational safety and health, and has earned a number of designations in insurance and safety, including ASP, CPCU, and ARM. She's a senior risk and safety consultant at Aspen Risk Management Group. And with that, welcome, Erica, and I'm going to go ahead and turn this presentation over to you now.
Hi, Michelle. Thank you. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the OSHA Update webinar. I am excited to be here. Let me go ahead and get my screen. Whoop. I don't know what screen I picked. Michelle, can we do that again?
Yeah, sure.
Actually, you know what?
It looked like you were headed to the right page, but go ahead. Let me hand it over to you again.
Sorry about that.
It's all right.
Jumped the gun on it. All right, we want to show this screen. There we go. All right, so let's go ahead and jump right into it because we do have a lot to cover. Before we start, I want to give you this quick disclaimer, right? Everything that we're going to talk about today is presented as information just in general. It hasn't applied to specific information about your company, right? I don't have that information. So this is an overview. It's not consultation or advice. It's just an overview of general information. It doesn't establish any kind of a client relationship between myself and any of you who are joining us today. All right, so here is a quick agenda of what we're going to cover. We always try to start this presentation by giving you guys some updates on injury and fatality data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and we also give you the most recent top 10 OSHA citations list and discuss some of that background information on OSHA before we get into published rulemaking schedules and what's going on there. So that lets us get a little bit of insight into all of the things that have happened, leading up to today. And it helps us to predict a little bit of what we can expect from OSHA going forward. So that's why we do that. Now, before we get into the data, I do want to talk a little bit about where it came from. It comes from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. I also want to point out that we're looking at, for fatal injury data, we're looking at 2022. And the reason why is because there's always a delay in the data that comes out for those fatal and non-fatal workplace incidents. It just allows time for that data collection to be done accurately and for statistical review to be done, right? So next year when we meet in April, we're going to talk about the 2023 loss data. So looking at 2022, this is going to give us some ideas of how workplace injuries and illnesses changed over that year, right? So we're kind of back to normal operations. COVID is pretty much in the past at this point. We still see it pop up here and there, but mostly that's over, right? Right. The reason we talk about all this in our presentation is because those fatalities, those injuries that happened in 2022, that actually directs OSHA's resources every year. So if we can see what they're flagging in the BLS data and what's documented by the Survey of Occupational Injuries and Illnesses, it helps us to predict where they're going to focus in the next year or so. So it's giving us that insight that I mentioned earlier. All right, so the census of fatal occupational injuries was used to tabulate all of this fatality data that you're seeing on the screen, right? This is based on all the data that we're talking about. It talks about injuries, not illnesses. And in this case, we're specifically talking about fatalities, right? So in 2022, we saw a 5.7 increase in fatalities resulting from injuries. In 2021, we saw 5,190 worker deaths, and the most recent data shows us 5,486 fatal work injuries in 2022. That means that a worker died from a work-related injury every 96 minutes in that year. There is an increase in fatalities due to violence in 2022, with homicides accounting for 61.7% of those deaths. And there is also a trend in unintentional overdose, right? That's continued over the last couple of years to go up. So there's a 13.1 increase in those fatalities over the prior year, 2021. There were 525 fatalities from overdoses in the most recent year, right? And 464, right, the prior year. So we're definitely seeing some increases here. This chart shows us fatal work injury rate per 100,000 full-time equivalent workers. And that's by occupational group, right? So I want to talk about a few data points here driving increases in fatalities among some of these, right? First, transportation and material moving stays right at the top of that list with 1,620 fatal work injuries. That fatality rate is primarily driven by a 16.3% increase in deaths for drivers and sales workers and truck drivers. And there were 1,115 motor vehicle operators that died in 2022, right? So that's something to focus on. Then construction workers right there in number 2, right? So construction workers had more fatalities in 2022 than in 2021, with 1,056 deaths, which is up from 951 the prior year. Falls, slips, or trips precipitated 423 of those fatalities. In 2022, protective service occupations such as firefighters, police and sheriff patrol officers, and transit and railroad police saw 335 fatalities, another increase, 11% over the prior year, right? And that, in 2021, we actually saw a 32% increase, so these are up quite a bit. Close to half of these fatalities were due to homicides and suicides. There were some decreases in fatalities for employees who work in installation, maintenance, and repair occupations, and in building and grounds cleaning. So there are some areas where we're seeing some decreases, which is good. Okay, so this is our first poll question. So Michelle, I'm going to let you go ahead and launch that one.
Okay, and the question is, what is the leading cause of fatalities in the workplace? Falls, slips, and trips, transportation incidents, violence in the workplace, or contact with objects? And we'll give it a couple seconds here. Thank you for everybody for your participation and being quick on the trigger. We got about 50%. Let me wait a little bit longer. Oh, here we go. Now people are chiming in. Okay, it looks like, oh shoot, what just happened? I'm sorry. Uh-oh, I'm sorry. Oh, here we go. Yep, I did. Okay, so it looks like 38% said falls, trips and slips, 40% said transportation and incidents, and 18 violence in the workplace, and 5% with objects.
Okay, so those falls and transportation incidents are pretty close together. All right, so let's look at the chart from the BLS data, right? So this shows us it's actually transportation, right? So it stays that most frequent type of fatality It makes up 37.7% of all the work-related fatalities in 2022, and that's an increase of 4.2%. So of the 2,066 fatalities that were related to transportation, 1,369 of them occurred in roadway incidents involving motorized land vehicles, right? So those are those car and truck accidents. 325 were pedestrian vehicular incidents. So I want to go ahead and look at each of these major events and not just focus on that one, right? So falls, right? The second one. So you guys are right on track there. We had 865 deaths resulting from falls. 81% were falls to a lower level. So if you think about those falls from ladders or from other height exposures, right? That's kind of the concern there. You want to make sure that you have appropriate fall protection in place for your employees, right? So in a few minutes, we're going to talk about the top 10 OSHA citations, and you're going to see fall protection on that list, and with good reason, because we're still seeing these fatalities happen, right? All right, so then when we look at fatalities that result from contact with objects or equipment, 66% of those were a result of being struck by objects or equipment, right? Those jumped a little bit to 738 in 2022 as compared to 705 in 2021. And then fatalities as a result of violence or other injuries by persons or animals increased nearly 12% in 2022 to 849 deaths. I want to call out something that OSHA noted in the data here. The largest subcategory is initial injuries by person, and it increased another 10% in 2022 after being up about 10% in 2021. We're going to talk about this a little bit more because we're going to get into a new requirement for workplace violence prevention plans in California, so that'll come back. Also, we have exposure to harmful substances or environments. That one led to 798 worker fatalities in 2022. This is a higher figure, right? And then we've got that unintentional overdose from non-medical use of drugs and alcohol, accounting for 58.1% of those fatalities or 464 deaths, right? So that brings our attention to the effects of addiction and drug use and then its impact on the workplace. And then that final major event category of fires and explosions had a 29% increase to 107 incidents in 2022. So it's pretty close to levels that we last saw in 2018, right? So it's actually rising, right? It dropped a little bit, and now it's going right back up. So having talked about these fatalities, I want to step away from that now and also focus on injuries and where those occurred, right? So this chart gives us a comparison of total recordable injury cases, and it shows in orange that cases involving days away from work, job restriction, or transfer, and then those other recordable cases are in green. So you can see that the numbers are pretty consistent with a slight increase in the number of days away from work or restriction over the last 3 years. Those incident rates that you see in the labeling are based on those 100 full-time employee equivalents, right? So this is a method that we use to compare small and large companies by figuring out their rates based on the same number of annual work hours. You're going to see this throughout the presentation, so I just wanted to clarify that a little bit. In 2022, private industry employers reported 2.8 million non-fatal workplace injuries and illnesses, which was a 7.5% increase over the prior year. Both injuries and illnesses increased in 2022. The drop in total cases between the 2 years reflects, actually, let me skip that part because that is not applicable here. So I want to look at where we're seeing those, right? So overexertion and bodily injury reaction resulted in the most cases with days away from work. And those are often related to things, to material handling, right? So that's lifting, carrying, reaching, bending, twisting, pushing, and pulling. So having controls in place that limit how much something can weigh when you're moving it around, or how much people are allowed to lift, that can help making sure that the size of objects lifted are appropriate and that people know to get help and to use proper body mechanics and awareness. Those can all help to prevent those kinds of injuries. So before we get into those OSHA regulations, I want to do a quick review of OSHA just real quick, how they're organized and what they're designed to do. So OSHA was founded in 1970 because of a spike in injuries and fatalities that occurred during the 60s. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration is designed to create regulations to establish a baseline for employee safety that employers have to follow to prevent those injuries and illnesses. Fed OSHA covers all federal employees, states that don't have their own plan, and employers that don't fall under a state plan. 21 states and Puerto Rico have their own state plans that cover private and government workplaces, and 6 states in the Virgin Islands have plans that cover only government workers. You can see that chart right there on your screen that kind of shows how that's all broken down, right? Regulations that are set by the federal government create the baseline for state plans, right? So state plans have to either meet or exceed federal government regulations. And state and federal plans usually divide their operations into enforcement and consultation, and then they might have some other specialty units to meet different needs, like doing elevator inspections or pressure vessel certifications, for example. And then you also have an appeals board for reviewing cases that employers fight, and a standards board for developing those new regulations. And that brings us to our next poll question. Michelle?
Okay, the next question is, which regulation do you think was cited the most in 2023? Machine guarding, lockout, tagout, ladders, or fall protection? And I'm gonna give it a couple seconds here. One person was asking if they heard you correctly that the unintentional overdoses, those are considered workplace injuries?
If it happens in the workplace, yeah. So if it happens in the workplace, and I have to go through and make sure I'm being accurate here, but sometimes unintentional overdose can occur because of work activity, but I believe they're also documenting people who are overdosing in the workplace.
Gotcha. Okay, well, looks like, thank you. It looks like we've got a majority have voted. It looks like 47% say fall protection. We've got 16% ladders, 24 lockout, tag out, and 14 machine guarding.
Good. Okay. So it sounds like you guys were picking up on a hint that I gave earlier. So here's a list of those top 10 citations. This is from 2023. It's based on fiscal year. So 1 through 10, the top 10 citations, right? Fiscal year, not calendar year. The reason why I show these in this presentation is because it's good for you guys to know what's required, because it's important to make sure that you've addressed them in the workplace, right? OSHA releases this to tell us what they're catching most companies doing wrong, so we can put those things in place. So the citation most frequently cited in 2023 was fall protection. The top 10 list doesn't actually change very much, usually from year to year. So the top 10 here are fall protection, hazard communication, ladders, scaffolding, powered industrial trucks, or those forklifts, lockout, tagout, respiratory protection, fall protection training, personal protective and life-saving equipment, or PPE, and machine guarding. So one thing that I've noticed here when looking at this data, and I left some of this information in there so you could see it, is that as predicted, we saw an uptick in the number of citations that were handed out, right? So for each of the top 10 on this slide, you can see how many citations were given in 2023 and how many in 2022, just for comparison. Many of these relate to working at heights. So remember what we saw with fatalities from falling from heights, right? These citations for fall protection training, proper use of ladders and scaffolding all relate to companies who aren't using the proper methods to prevent those types of injuries and fatalities. Safety around chemicals also pops up in a lot of these citations, with hazard communication in the second spot, respiratory protection at number 7, and then PPE at number 9. So employees have the right to know what chemicals they're exposed to and to understand how to protect themselves when they're using those chemicals, or if they're exposed to chemicals in the workplace, right? They also have to have the right PPE to protect themselves and to understand what to use and why they need to use it. We're going to come back and touch on hazard communication again a little bit later. So how can you end up with an inspection from OSHA? So on-site inspections are prioritized to address more dangerous situations first. If there's any report of an imminent danger, that's going to trigger an inspection. This is usually a report where death or serious harm is threatened, and it's reasonably likely to see that a serious accident could occur either immediately, or if not immediately, then before that issue could be abated, or something else could be put in place to protect employees, right? Serious injuries and fatalities and reports of imminent danger are prioritized above other triggers for on-site inspections. Complaints and referrals are next on that priority list. Complaints are reports from current or former employees of a hazard in the workplace, and they're reviewed to determine whether they need to do an on-site visit or not, right? So if they see that there's serious or imminent hazard, physical harm has occurred, the company has a history of citations, or the company was already targeted or scheduled for an inspection, then they're likely to show up on site. Companies that don't respond, if OSHA sends them a letter or calls them or sends them a fax regarding some kind of low severity hazard in a complaint, they could also get a visit. So inspections due to complaints, those are the easiest ones to avoid. If we complete our safety inspections, follow our safety programs, provide training, listen to what the employees are telling us and act on their concerns, right? Those complaints are less likely to be filed. And then if OSHA reaches out, it's always important to respond to those questions and concerns that they're reaching out about. Referrals, those are reports from other sources. So not just your current or former employees, it could be somebody walking by, it could be from a media story or a compliance officer that drove by a job site and saw employees doing something and decided to stop in and do an inspection. Other federal agencies, state or local health departments, the police, the fire department, all of them can also refer OSHA about any concerns, and they treat them the same as a complaint. And then inspections can be initiated to follow up on the status of violations that were received in an earlier inspection. So if you have violations that haven't been corrected, then the company is actually subject to a new violation for failure to abate, and that can result in increased penalties over what's already been assigned to them. And then finally, inspections can be initiated because of programs that are created at the federal, state, and local levels. So those are usually inspections based on high hazard industries, occupations with specific hazards, or other site characteristics. So there's been a focus on silica, trenching and excavation, crane work. All of those things are things that OSHA is looking at a little bit more seriously in doing inspections on. And then workplaces can be targeted based on their loss history. So if a company has significantly higher injury rates as compared to their peers, they can be targeted. So for example, in California, companies with an experience modification rate of 1.25 or higher can be targeted for inspection. And usually what happens is the company gets a letter that says they can access consultation services, and if they don't respond and take advantage of that offer, then an enforcement inspector gets assigned and they have an inspection instead. So if you ever get one of those, it's worth it to have a consultation over an inspector who's out there to cite you for the hazards, for the violations that they see. All right, so now that we've talked about what can trigger an inspection, briefly I want to talk about some of the common mistakes that we see employers run into, and then we'll dive into those OSHA changes. So when an OSHA inspection occurs, or if OSHA reaches out, and I mentioned this before, the last thing you want to do is ignore that request. So failing to meet an OSHA deadline, almost certain to result in additional inspections and interactions with OSHA, and that increases your likelihood of being cited for something. Another thing that companies do to get ahead of citations, they try to provide more information than what OSHA requested. That can get turned around on you though, if OSHA finds something within what you sent them that results in more citations. So it's best to only give them exactly what they requested. Another common issue is just having weak safety programs. Anything that's outdated, incomplete, or if it doesn't reflect your actual operations, it's not going to be sufficient to meet OSHA standards. There is help available for you for developing programs. You can talk to your insurance carrier, broker, safety professionals like consultants, or reach out to safety councils to get help, right? Your workers' compensation carrier, broker, and OSHA all have resources available to help you. You can also work with OSHA consultation because it's their job to help you get on the right track with those resources. So lots of resources to help address weak safety programs. A program can also be considered ineffective if it doesn't actually address the hazards in the workplace, or if employees haven't been trained on those required elements, right? So also if you're not following through, right? So you have, an injury and illness prevention program in California requires that you do accident investigation, should be one of those, it should be part of that written program. But if you're not actually doing accident investigation, you can't show that you've done it, that could cause a problem. So document everything that you do in the eyes of OSHA, because if it's not documented, they would say it didn't happen. So training records, inspection records, accident investigations, all of those things show that you're actually doing what you said you would do within your program. And then it's important to know that even if you have an OSHA inspection, as an employer, you have rights. So it's important to know what your rights are. When OSHA requires that you turn something in, if you aren't able to provide it within the timeline allotted, you can always request an extension. They don't always allow it, but it's worth requesting it if you can't put it together quickly enough, especially if they gave you a deadline that was kind of unrealistic. You also have the right to file an appeal, and you want to reserve that right, right? So filing an appeal can reserve that right so that you can fight things later on. You have a timeline that you have to meet for that. You can request a meeting with the OSHA area manager. And sometimes that results in negotiations to close out citations, but you should be aware that if you accept citations, they actually become a part of the company's record, and that is posted online. So anyone can go to a website, type in your company name, and see when you were inspected and what you were cited for. And then those citations can sometimes affect your eligibility if you bid on jobs, for example, as a contractor, right? So be aware of that. A lot of employers just don't realize also about these final two items that I want to call attention to. So the first one is that every employer has to report serious injuries and fatalities to OSHA, and you have a very short window of time to get it done. So most people on this call are located either in California or in a state that falls under Fed OSHA, so I want to focus on those requirements. Fed OSHA says that you have to report fatalities within 8 hours, and serious injuries, which they define as an amputation, loss of an eye, or inpatient hospitalization within 24 hours. In California, you have 8 hours to report, period. And they also add on permanent disfigurement, okay? So failure to report a citation starts at $5,000 before OSHA has completed an inspection. So this one is really important. If you're not sure if something qualifies, you can always call OSHA and they're going to tell you if that qualifies. The second thing employers forget to do is to follow record keeping regulations, which we're going to talk about more a little bit later. But from February 1st through April 30th of every year, the OSHA 300A, which is the summary of injuries, has to be posted in a common area for employers with 10 or more full-time employees, except for a couple of industries that are exempt. So most companies have to do this. Also, large employers with 250 or more employees and those in certain high hazard industries have to submit their documents electronically. And we're going to touch on this a little bit later in the presentation. If that posting is missing or the electronic submission wasn't completed, that can also result in a citation. So really important things to be aware of. And that brings us to another poll question.
Okay, so this next polling question, do you have a plan of how to handle OSHA if an inspector shows up at your company? Yes or no? And while we're waiting for people to vote, someone asked if an employee is injured or dies in a car wreck while driving company-owned vehicle to the job or to or from job site, is that recordable?
So this changed recently, and I believe it used to be that if it was on a public roadway, it was investigated by highway patrol or by the police, right? And it was not a reportable incident. I believe that has changed, and it is now something that has to be recorded and reported.
Okay, and then just one more quick question.
And I'll double check that, Michelle.
Okay.
I'm pretty sure that's right, but I know it changed, and I want to make sure that I'm clear. So that can be something that we confirm.
Okay, and we'll follow up with Mr. Dunkus or Dunkel later. Okay, so everybody's voted. Let's go ahead, and it looks like 61% say yes and 39% say no.
Good. Okay. It's always a good idea to have that plan in place because usually what happens when OSHA shows up is people kind of panic a little bit and they get nervous. So if you have a plan for somebody who's responsible to speak with OSHA, who knows kind of how to handle that situation, that is always far better. Okay. So I'm going to start moving through these a little bit more quickly so we can get into those OSHA changes. This is a list of maximum minimum penalties. These are now tied to inflation and stuff. So they change every year. So this is an updated list. I'm not going to dive into it too much, but just be aware that they continue to increase over time. All right, so pre-rule stage, right? These are federal regulations that OSHA has said they're interested in creating, right? So they're collecting data usually, putting things together. This list hasn't really changed since last year. So a lot of this should look pretty similar, right? It's OSHA kind of gathering information, figuring out the scope of the problem, and then putting things in place. So having said that, because it hasn't changed a whole lot, I'm going to skip through this a little bit and just go quickly, right? So there's a bunch of standards that you're going to see throughout this presentation that basically OSHA is saying we need to update these because technology has changed, performance specifications have changed, there's been a lot of developments in safety and health practices, and industries incorporating them, but our regulations really don't address them. So for both process safety management and mechanical power presses, we're looking at changes that are based on improvements in technology and practices. Mechanical power presses, for example, they don't address hydraulic and pneumatic power presses, right? That regulation's 40 years old. It's just really outdated. So they're working on updating these. Okay, and that brings us to another poll question.
Okay, the next one is, are there any areas in your workplace that can get a little warm? Yes or no? And we'll give it a
Think
toss.
about kind of all the things that your employees do, and if anybody works in an area that might get a little bit warm.
Okay, let's see, we've got about 50% voted, so give it just a couple more seconds here. And just a reminder, if we don't get to your, because there's such a lot of information that we're covering today, if we don't get to your question, we will be addressing each question that you have submitted to us in a follow-up email. So just wanted to give that a little tidbit so that you don't worry. Okay, so it looks like 74% say yes and 25 say no.
Okay. All right, so the reason why I asked that question is because OSHA has been talking for a while about putting in place a heat illness prevention standard, right? So this came about because OSHA was petitioned by a bunch of organizations and individuals who are really pushing hard that they should address this. And it's kind of been in limbo for a while. So there are some states that have standards in place, California, Washington, Oregon, and Nevada, we're gonna see in a little bit, they're working on or considering developing a standards, right? So the reason why this is important is I wanna point out a couple of things, right? There are fatalities from heat exposure every single year. This hasn't changed, and that's one of those areas of focus that OSHA has had for a while. 50 to 70% of fatalities from heat occur in the first few days of working in a hot environment. Those new employees, it takes time for them to acclimate to working in the heat. So if you have employees who work in hot environments, you want to incorporate that idea into your new hire procedures and into your practices so that new employees are observed for signs of heat stress. And so they're coached and prodded and encouraged to drink water, to take breaks, and to speak up if they don't feel well. So there is a meeting scheduled on this on April 24th to consider rulemaking on this topic. So it looks like it's starting to move forward again. So hopefully we'll see where that one goes. All right, OSHA is also looking at revising standards for exposure to lead. Again, these are just really old standards. They haven't been updated since 1978 for general industry and since 1993 for construction. So there's a lot of research and recent medical findings that indicate that lower blood lead levels in adults can result in adverse health effects, things like hypertension, cognitive dysfunction, and then effects on renal function and reproductive systems. So OSHA is looking into, can we reduce those blood lead level triggers in the medical surveillance and medical removal protection provisions of the general industry and construction standards for lead? And they're kind of looking into what they can do there. So there is some disagreement between researchers on where those thresholds should be set. Some say any exposure to workers puts them at risk, but in general, everybody's recommending lower thresholds. So we'll see where they end up on that, but that one is out there and they're looking at it. Okay, and that brings us to another poll question.
Okay, which industry has a rate of workplace violence that is nearly 5 times the rate experienced by all workers? Is it construction, healthcare, retail, or education? And we'll give it a second here. We have had quite a few questions, so again, just a reminder, we will be answering those individually in a follow-up email if we run out of time. So it looks like, let's see here, that's pretty close. I'm going to give it one more second. I like to wait till it's at 70%, but let's go ahead and close this out now. So it looks like we've got construction at 29%, healthcare at 28, retail at 30, and education at 13.
Okay, so workplace violence, healthcare workers accounted for 73% of all non-fatal workplace injuries and illnesses from violence in 2018. In 2018, the incident rate for non-fatal occupational injuries as a result of workplace violence in healthcare and social assistance was 10.4 per 10,000 full-time workers. And if you looked at the rate for all workers, it was 2.1. So that's where that 5 times number comes from. The rates in healthcare actually continue to rise in terms of violence. And the data that you're looking at on the chart that you see on your screen, that was collected before the COVID pandemic, right? So it's likely gotten worse. OSHA was petitioned to address healthcare in 2017. The rulemaking on this has just kind of stalled and not moved forward so much. Next step for the federal level, if they're looking at engaging small businesses in the rulemaking process, there are some states that do have workplace violence protection plan requirements for the healthcare industry as well. Okay, so let's jump to the state, right? So let's look at what a couple of states are doing at this point. So Oregon, they're looking into, and they have been for a while, looking into updating permissible exposure limits for lead and manganese, right? So they were also, they had a meeting in 2017. They've been working on this one, hasn't moved forward a whole lot. Oregon was also working on a rulemaking for employees who work in industries where they might be asked to fight in fire containment activities. However, they had this meeting in March with OSHA's Fire Service Advisory Committee, and they decided to pause that plan because the federal government looks like they're taking this up and maybe working on it. So that one was paused. So that's where Oregon is. State of Washington, they have quite a few things that they're working on. So they're looking to update the standard for cranes, rigging, and personnel lifting. That's to meet federal requirements. So what the federal standard is, remember I said that if you have a state plan, you have to be at least as effective as the federal. They have to update their standard to meet those federal requirements. So that's one that's out there. They're also looking at rulemaking for occupational health protections related to infectious diseases to ensure that the state has general guidelines to follow in case of an infectious disease outbreak. So that would include when there's an outbreak subject to a public health emergency under a national or state declared state of emergency. Because of all the chaos that we saw with the COVID-19 pandemic, I think what they're trying to do is kind of establish some kind of a plan for how they would handle that kind of situation going forward. When you look at fatality investigations for trenching and excavation, conclusions from those investigations have found that a better approach to risk analysis and rescue planning could serve to greatly reduce the likelihood of similar fatalities in the future. So Washington is looking at considering employers to develop and implement written excavation plans detailing appropriate risk analyses and rescue planning prior to doing any work requiring a protective system. So that's typically for excavations 4 feet or deeper, not in stable or solid rock, right? So there's a draft rule they're working on for that. Agriculture, they're looking at creating some basic health and safety requirements for pre-commercial thinning. So that would affect employees in Washington in reforestation, timber tracts, Christmas tree growing, and tree farms. And then there's a requirement for Washington OSHA to address a state bill, House bill that came through and was passed by the Washington State Legislature in the 2023 session. And it requires training and certification programs be developed for individuals who apply fire-resistant materials, and then it provides for enforcement. So they're working on that. And then lead also is another one that Washington's working on. So a bunch of stuff going on in those states. Now I want to move on to proposed regulations. These are one where OSHA has developed what they think is going to be the regulation, and then they get feedback from stakeholders and they do all kinds of research into it to figure out if it's going to make sense and if it's going to work. This is the list. We're not going to do a deep dive on all of these because these really haven't changed much in the last year. So I'm going to actually go ahead and do the question.
Okay.
but let's go for like 40% because I don't want to run out of time.
Okay, so workers may be exposed to silica and sand, stone, concrete, brick, and mortar when they select all that apply. Cut, drill, or grind it, use a jackhammer to break it up, operate crushing, drilling, or milling equipment during blasting or tunneling operations. And
So,
I'm here.
oh,
Can you
you
hear me?
broke up a little bit. Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Share. No, that's okay. I'm sure it was posted so everybody can see it.
Okay, so let's go ahead and we'll close this out. 57, let me share this, 57% say cut, drill, or grind it. 10% says use a jackhammer, 24% operate crushing, and 9% say during blasting or tunneling.
Okay, so this is a tricky question. It's actually every single one of those things can expose employees to silica. So that, and also, even if they're not doing those activities, but they're working around somebody who is doing that, they can be exposed. So really important to have controls in place. Wet methods are one of the best controls, right? So keeping that material wet helps to reduce the amount of dust. If somebody's doing something and it's creating dust, then you might have to have other controls and even respirators in place, right? So something to be aware of. It's something that I see a lot of on construction sites where those things aren't controlled, and that's on there because that's one of those standards that OSHA is looking at updating. So
So
a lot of these, go ahead.
I'm sorry. So I guess we didn't have they couldn't select more than one answer. So maybe just brought that to, so we'll fix that. Thanks.
Sorry. All right. So everything that's on this list, these are things that OSHA is updating, right? So these are changes that have occurred in technology or because maybe there is an error or an issue in the regulation. And so OSHA is going back and fixing all of these. And that's why these are all listed together. Lockout, tagout, it's just really old from 1989. So there's been a lot of changes in technology. You've got computer-based controls and things like that that actually provide different levels of protection. So that one is out there. Response and preparedness, because again, this is decades old. And so they want to make sure that they're recognizing appropriate controls. This is where those fire brigades come up that we talked about a little bit earlier, that one of the states put their regulation on hold because OSHA is working on it. Cranes and derricks has some errors in it that they're trying to correct. Shipyard fall protection, they felt like this regulation is not as comprehensive as it should be for shipyards, so they're making some changes to that one. Welding and cutting standard, some updates there. And then PPE and construction, they want to clarify that requirements for fit of personal protective equipment, right? So making sure that when people are given PPE that it actually fits them properly. So that's that one. And PIT, so there are some ANSI updates that they're going to incorporate into the regulation. So that's real quick, things that are being updated. This is another couple that have been sitting out there for a while. So communication tower and tree care, both hazardous industries to work in, right? So high hazard industries, and OSHA wants to put some specific regulations in place. So for communication tower industry, having better fall protection, personnel hoisting requirements that are more appropriate for that industry is something that they're looking at. And then for tree care, there isn't really a regulation that specifically affects tree care. And so OSHA is looking at creating regulations specific to that industry, right? So that it's a little bit clearer instead of a hodgepodge of pulling things from other regulations to apply it there. All right, so that's those two. Infectious disease, this is one that OSHA has been working on for quite a while. The idea is to address high hazard environments. So protecting employees who have a higher risk of exposure to infectious diseases like tuberculosis, chickenpox, measles, right? And then also your new and emerging threats. So SARS would be an example, or COVID-19. It focuses on healthcare workers and workers in emergency response, correctional facilities, homeless shelters, drug treatment programs, and occupational settings where employees can be at increased risk of exposure to potentially infectious people. This one is on the agenda for discussion on April 24th. So this is one that may be moving forward as well. All right. Walking and working surfaces, real quick, there was an error in a 2016 publication regulation and they're going back to fix it. So basically a couple of things created some confusion. One is related to stairways narrower than 44 inches with 2 open sides. OSHA is clarifying that a handrail is required on each open side because the way they wrote it was confusing. The second change is in rail height requirements based on the date of construction because of some unclear language that unintentionally appeared to change the requirement for handrail height. So they're going back and fixing that, but stairs installed during that period between when that regulation took effect until this update actually goes through will actually be considered acceptable. The walk around representative, this one is expected to be finalized pretty shortly. Once it's published, the rule will take effect in 30 days. So the proposed walk around rule is intended to clarify Section 8E of the Occupational Safety and Health Act and 29 CFR 1903.8C, which reads in part, if in the judgment of the compliance safety and health officer, good cause has been shown, why accompaniment by a third party who is not an employee of the employer, such as an industrial hygienist or safety engineer, is reasonably necessary to conduct an effective and thorough physical inspection of the workplace, such third party may accompany the compliance safety and health officer during the inspection. So this one allows third parties, either union representatives or others, to accompany an OSHA inspector during their walkthrough. That's essentially what it is. That rule was published on April 1st. They have now established an FAQ, and I put the link here on the slide so you can look at it if you're curious. It outlines some additional information. So the FAQ provides some guidelines that state that an employee representative cannot enter areas for workplace that contain or could reveal trade secrets, take photographs or measurements, prevent the OSHA inspector from carrying out their own responsibilities, or talk to others about unrelated matters, right? So they're only there for the inspection itself. They can't wander off away from the inspection. They can't engage in solicitation or distribution of materials, and they can't be involved in the inspector's interviews with employees unless that employee specifically asks for them to attend. So that's part of those FAQs that I wanted to point out are available for you. All right, so let's move on and look at states. California, so Fed OSHA, again, hasn't really moved forward with those blood lead levels. California is working on this one too, right? So just like some other states that we saw working on this, Oregon and Washington before, this one has been around for a little while and hasn't moved forward that much either. So that's their indoor heat illness. So this regulation was scheduled for a vote on March 21st of this year. It was pulled off the agenda because there is some feedback from the California Department of Finance, and then labor groups who were there in the room protested that it was removed from the agenda, and the standards board moved forward and voted on it. They unanimously approved the proposed standard. However, because it was originally moved from the agenda, it's kind of unclear what's going to happen from here. So the vote kind of appears to be more symbolic than anything, and there are some questions as to what this means for employers and whether the proposed law will be published as it is. As written, the proposed regulation has a trigger of 82 degrees Fahrenheit when employees are present, with 87 degrees considered high heat. And once you hit high heat, there are additional precautions that have to be met. So water has to be provided, as well as access to cool down areas, and employees who show symptoms have to be monitored. The employer has to allow employees sufficient time to recover from feeling ill before sending them back to work. And then once that threshold of 87 degrees is met, or employees have a greater risk of heat illness because of radiant heat or because of their PPE or clothing that they have to wear, then they have to maintain records showing that they're monitoring temperature, either by the temperature itself or by the heat index, whichever is greater. And then otherwise requirements are basically similar to that of outdoor heat illness, right? So you have to have a plan, you have to observe during acclimatization, that time when they're getting used to working in the heat. You have to monitor the heat, you have to provide water, you have to let them cool down, you have to train employees, and you have to have a plan for emergencies. So that's kind of where that one is, and hopefully we'll get an update on that soon. Nevada has also proposed a heat illness prevention plan requirement They heard from stakeholders and adjusted their trigger temperature to 90 degrees. The regulation requires employers of employees who are exposed to temperatures at or above a dry bulb temperature of 90 degrees Fahrenheit to develop and implement a written heat illness prevention plan that addresses how water and shade will be provided, ensures rest breaks for employees showing symptoms and signs and symptoms, addresses acclimatization and monitoring employees for signs and symptoms, identifies work that might generate additional heat exposure, provides training to employees, and has an emergency plan. So it kind of sounds similar to what we were just talking about with that indoor heat plan in California. The regulation did not pass during the 2023 legislation, but it's possible that it will still be issued. They have said that if the federal government comes out with their own regulation, then they'll follow the federal government. In the meantime, they're using the general duty clause to enforce heat illness prevention and make sure that employees are safe. Washington. So Washington has a petition requesting that they update language specific to firefighting personnel involved in hazardous materials incidents. There have been a lot of, again, technological advances since this rule was originally written, including in PPE materials, certification, and testing. So they're proposing amendments to update that required standards for hazardous materials protective equipment. For warehouse distribution centers, this is based on a House bill that went through, and the proposed rule would create new protections for warehouse distribution center workers who are subject to performance quotas. And what OSHA is trying to do now is they have to share responsibility for enforcing this bill with LNI's Fraud Prevention and Labor Standards Division. And they're all conducting separate but coordinating rulemaking to try and address what was passed by the legislature. So DOSHA's proposed rules provide clarification on the occupational health and safety standards for quotas created by the House bill and describe how they're going to enforce the requirements of the bill. And then they reiterate quota time period and reasonable travel time requirements, and it clarifies how they would measure employer size to determine whether an employer is actually covered by the rules, and also how record keeping requirements and enforcement procedures will affect companies, as well as employee protections and retaliation protections. So there's an anticipated effective date on this one of July 1st, but they're still taking comments right now through April 22nd, so another week or so. An expedited rulemaking process for fall protection was also filed in February. This is to modify existing state regulations because they're not meeting the Fed OSHA standard. So they have to update some things to be in line. Specifically, they're addressing leading edge work, safety monitor system requirements, and roofing activity on low pitched roofs. So that's Washington, and that's where we are for there. And then we move on to regulations that are in the final rules stage, which they can still run into some hurdles before they get published and actually become law. So again, these are the federal final rules. A lot is the same, okay? So not a lot has changed since last year. So very quickly, there are some whistleblower updates that have been in there for, I don't know, maybe 2 years, 3 years now. Basically, they're just trying to update these, right? The intent is to allow for the efficient processing of complaints under whistleblower status and to protect persons who filed, testify, or participate in, or are otherwise involved in the investigation or any proceedings related to a violation. So they're trying to make those consistent procedures, consistent among all of the statutes so that it's better for employers to understand, for employees to understand, right? Just to get that consistency out there. So that is one. And that brings us to what, I don't think this is the last. I think this is the second to last poll question.
Yeah, it's the second to the last, but we are running out of time. So
Yeah.
how do you want to handle it, Erica?
Let's skip it.
Okay.
Skip it. I'm going to do HAZCOM really quick because essentially this is one we covered last year. This is basically an update to an existing standard. So HAZCOM is there. This protects employees. It lets them understand how to be safe working around chemicals and what they're exposed to. And it was aligned with the globally harmonized system. What they're trying to do now is, because the globally harmonized system gets updated every It gets updated all the time. They're, I think, in revision 9, but they want to update the current standard to revision 7. So what they're trying to do is address some problems and some things that people complained about and just update the standard to meet what the United Nations has in place. And the globally harmonized system basically brought countries in line with each other to get a standard set up for safety data sheets and to make those pictograms consistent, right? That came through several years ago. So they're updating to separate out, so for example, aerosols, right? They're going to require things like desensitized explosives to be identified and communicated. Those are chemicals treated in a way that stabilizes the chemical, reduces its explosive properties. They felt like people didn't really understand that there was a difference there and that they needed to understand the higher risk. They're going to separate out flammable gases to call out some higher hazard levels with pyrophoric gases and chemically unstable gases. They are updating label requirements. So labels for small containers, it was hard to do for employers. So they actually put out a letter of interpretation. They're going to codify the guidance on that. That makes it easier for employers to meet the standard. And then they're going to address the fact that some chemicals get packed up and are still on site. Something changes and they used to require relabeling, but now they can just insert an update into the packaging. And they're protecting trade secrets a little bit better. And then they're going to use the exclamation point pictogram for hazards that are not otherwise classified. So that's something that they're putting in place. They were allowing this since 2016, but it's going to be part of the regulation. And they're going to propose some principles for addressing situations where a substance is a mixture and there are a bunch of different hazards so that you can prioritize your precautionary statements. So that's in short what's involved there. A lot of that is going to affect not employers so much, but manufacturers and suppliers. Workplace injuries and illnesses. This one took effect on January 1st. So this is that record keeping requirement for electronically submitting to OSHA certain information from the OSHA Form 300. It modified who has to submit, requiring submission from establishments with 20 or more employees in certain high hazard industries, and those with 100 or more in the highest hazard industries. It did not drop as originally proposed, those in 250 or more employers, right? So originally 250 or more employers who weren't in high hazard, we thought that was going to go away, but it kept that. And that took place actually and is in effect now. So January 1st was when that one became law. Administrative procedures, again, we saw this in 2023. We talked about it then. This is intended to clarify and be more transparent around subpoena practices across the agency so that OSHA, basically they use these in the course of their investigations and they want to make that consistent throughout. And I'm going to keep it as simple as that because we are just about out of time. COVID and healthcare, they're trying to put something in place to make sure that healthcare workers are protected. By state, we're going to skip that too. Violence in the workplace, definitely a big issue, and it's something that California is addressing with their workplace violence prevention plan. And this is, I wanted to get to this before we run out of time, right? So you are going to be required as of July 1, if you're in California, to have a workplace violence prevention plan. There are a few exceptions, but it affects almost most employers. So there's 13 elements that are required. I'm not going to go through them all because we don't have time to cover them, but it also includes a violent incident log. So not only do you have to have a program, but you have to keep a log of any reported violent incidents. And that has different requirements that are listed out here. That program, you'll want to coordinate it with other things that you may have in place, or make sure you have these things in place if you don't already. So IAPP is a requirement in California, right? So coordinating with that, separate programs, but coordinated. Emergency action plan can also be something that coordinates with this, because you want to, that a workplace violence incident is an emergency, right? So that would be part of your EAP. You may have security measures that you want to beef up to address this. Having a plan for crisis management for those kinds of emergencies is helpful. And then employee assistance programs, providing access to employee assistance can really help employees who are coping with the aftermath of a workplace violent incidents, right? So any traumatic event, so having those things available is helpful. They're also, as of January 2025, they're going to expand the ability of employers to submit for a restraining order to protect employees who are who've been affected by workplace violence. So I'm not saying this properly. Essentially, the current law enables an employer to get a temporary restraining order to protect an employee from a person who's engaged in violence or made a credible threat of violence, but it didn't include harassment. The new regulation that goes into effect in January will let employers also obtain a temporary restraining order in situations of harassment. So if an employee is being harassed by somebody who comes into your place of work all the time and you want to be able to protect them, you're not limited to waiting until something actually happens or they're threatened with violence. You can actually take action ahead of time. So that's what that one is. All right. Oregon, SB 592 and 907, they're aligning with OSHA for 907. That is for employees' right to refuse certain work tasks. And 592 is basically a requirement that OSHA inspect based on different flags. So there are some increases and modifications to the regulations as a result of new state bills. And then that workplace injury and illness reporting, that's that federal one that we already talked about. Washington is updating their electrical code to meet the National Electrical Code based on new standards that came out. And that went into effect April 1. And then the process safety management, this is again, process safety management of highly hazardous chemicals. Let me see, this is for petroleum refineries, so not super applicable probably to most of the people on this call. There's an ergonomics law that was passed by the state legislature that's setting stringent criteria to identify at-risk industries, focusing on those with work-related musculoskeletal disorder claims with rates double the state average for 5 consecutive years. It requires L&I to issue a list of these high-risk industries every November. So there's going to be a list that comes out, and the goal is to incentivize and guide workplace improvements. It also provides financial aid to employers, right? You can get access to funds up to 2% of your accident fund premiums to buy necessary ergonomic equipment. So that's just changing how they were looking at those musculoskeletal disorders and looking at it from an ergonomics point of view and trying to address and prevent those injuries. All right, so there we go. We made it all the way to the end.
Thanks, Erica. And again, reminder, we're going to go ahead and send a link that you can get to access a copy of the presentation as well as the recording. So I want to thank everybody for attending today's webinar presented by Heffernan. We hope that all of the attendees found today's webinar to be a valuable use of your time. Be sure to join us on May 28th. And thank you, Erica, for our active shooter armed assailant response training for the DHS Ride, Hide, Fight protocol webinar. Thank you, Erica, for all the information, and everybody have a great and safe day.